I began my previous lecture by formulating a central criterion of adequacy for theories of conceptual content that Hegel sees as put in place by the crucial role they play in theories of knowledge. He opens his introduction by insisting that our semantic theory must not already doom us to epistemological skepticism. Our understanding of discursive contentfulness must at least leave open the possibility that by undertaking conceptually contentful commitments, we can, if all goes well, come to know how things really are. And then he argues that that condition cannot be met by an account that opens up a gulf of intelligibility, separating how things subjectively appear to us, how they are for consciousness, from how they objectively are in themselves. Modern epistemological theories since Descartes have understood knowledge as the product of two factors: the knower's grasp of subjective thoughts and those thoughts' representational relations to objective things. Knower's cognitive relations to those represented things are accordingly mediated by representings of them. On pain of an infinite regress, the relations between the knowers and their representings can't then in general be understood as themselves mediated and representational. At least some of the representings must be grasped immediately in the sense of non-representationally. I don't think that Hegel rejects as in principle broken-backed all epistemological theories exhibiting this two-stage representational structure. Rejecting theories of this form is not an essential element, certainly not the essential element, in the metaconceptual revolution from thinking in terms of categories with the structure of Verstand to thinking in terms of categories with the structure of Vernunft, which is what he's recommending. Rather, Hegel begins the phenomenology proper with the claim that the two-stage representational epistemological explanatory strategy leads inexorably to skeptical conclusions if, but only if, it's combined with a particular auxiliary hypothesis concerning the difference between representeds and representings, one that's tempting and in many ways natural. That's the idea that only representings, the appearances, the phenomena, are in conceptual shape, while what's represented by them, reality, the noumena, is not. On such a view, cognitive processes must transform, or at least map, non-conceptual reality into or onto conceptual presentations, since the representational relations those processes institute relate non-conceptual representeds to conceptual representings. Getting this picture in view is, I take it, the point of Hegel's metaphors of knowing as an instrument or the medium in the opening paragraphs. The culprit, the semantic assumption that threatens to enforce epistemological skepticism by excavating a gulf of intelligibility between thought and world, is the idea that only what we think and not the world we think about is conceptually articulated. The constructive suggestion that Hegel offers as an alternative to this assumption is a radically new, non-psychological conception of the conceptual. According to this conception, to be conceptually contentful is to stand in relations of material incompatibility, his determinate negation, and material consequence, his mediation, to other such contentful items. I call this a non-psychological conception of the conceptual because it can be detached from consideration of the processes or practices of applying concepts in judgment and intentional action. Objective states of affairs and properties, too, stand to one another in relations of material incompatibility and consequence, and are accordingly intelligible as already in conceptual shape, quite apart from any relations they might stand in to cognitive and practical activities of knowing and acting subjects. Indeed, if objective states of affairs and properties did not stand to one another in such relations, they would not be intelligible as so much as determinate, and we couldn't make sense of the idea that there's some definite way the world is. For that idea essentially involves the contrast with other ways the world might be, and the contrasts in virtue of which states of affairs and properties are determinate must involve modally exclusive differences, as well as mere differences. This non-psychological conception of the conceptual isn't elaborated in the introduction itself. Rather, it's the principal topic of the succeeding chapters on consciousness. I nonetheless discussed it in my first lecture because it's important to understand how Hegel proposes to avoid the danger of excavating a gulf of intelligibility, separating subjective conceptual representings from objective non-conceptual representeds. It's the danger of excavating such a gulf in the semantic theory of representation that he sees as potentially fatal to the epistemological enterprise. If the process of knowing must span such a gap, then Hegel thinks the possibility of genuine knowledge, knowledge of how things are in themselves, not just how they are for consciousness, will be ruled out in principle as unintelligible. Conceptual realism about the objective world, understood in terms of the new non-psychological conception of the conceptual, is Hegel's alternative. As I read it, the job of the last two-thirds of the introduction is to sketch a way of thinking about representation once the two-stage representational semantic model has been shorn of the objectionable collateral commitment to understanding representation as relating conceptual representings to non-conceptual representeds. This means showing how to satisfy two of the key criteria of adequacy I identified in my previous lecture. The mode of presentation condition requires an account of what it is to be, or even to purport to be, a representing of some represented, an appearance of something. Satisfying this condition is explaining what representation is. Laying out the structure and rationale of Hegel's account of representational purport and success will also shed light on the second desideratum. What I called the rational constraint condition requires that we explain how what knowing subjects, consciousness, is talking or thinking about what's represented can provide reasons for what they say or think about it. Explaining the account of representation Hegel sketches in the introduction and how it proposes to satisfy these conditions is my task this evening. Our ordinary pre-systematic, non-theoretical thought and talk about thinking and talking distinguishes between what we're thinking or saying on the one hand and what we're thinking or talking about on the other. We may accordingly say that intentionality, the contentfulness of thought and talk, has two dimensions: what we express when we say or think something, and what we represent in doing so. We can say both, Kant came to believe that Lampel was betraying him, and Kant believed of his faithful servant that he was betraying Kant. In the first, the declarative sentence that follows the that expresses the content of the belief, and in the second, the noun phrase within the scope of the of says what the belief is about. What I've called Hegel's non-psychological conception of the conceptual, which construes conceptual contentfulness as consisting in standing in relations of material incompatibility and consequence, is a model of what one says or thinks, the first dimension of intentionality or contentfulness, what we could call that intentionality. For that reason, I'll call this the conceptual dimension of intentional contentfulness. The question on the table now is how Hegel understands the other representational dimension of intentionality, the intentionality that says what we're talking or thinking of or about. The empiricists had pursued an order of explanation that begins with representational contentfulness and seeks, in effect, to understand and to explain conceptual contentfulness more generally in terms of it. One potential advantage of such an approach is that representation shows up as a genus of which conceptual representation is just one species. As I understand him, Hegel pursues a complementary order of explanation. The project he outlines in the introduction is to explain the notion of representation in terms of his non-psychological concept of conceptual contentfulness. In what follows, I want to explain how I understand his strategy for pursuing this conceptualist order of explanation. For one of the principal lessons I think we ought to learn from Hegel concerns his working out such an alternative to the representationalist order of explanation of the two dimensions of intentionality, which has dominated the philosophical semantics of the philosophical tradition of the past century that we inherit, every bit as much as it had dominated the necessarily somewhat shorter philosophical tradition that Hegel inherited. Hegel has a big new idea about how to explain representational content in terms of conceptual content, understood non-psychologically as he does in terms of articulation by relations of material incompatibility and consequence. The way he fills in that conceptualist idea is best understood as a way of combining and jointly developing two Kantian ideas that I've already adverted to. The first is Kant's normative account of judgment. What distinguishes judgments from the responses of merely natural creatures, for Kant, is that we are in a distinctive way responsible for our judgments. They express commitments of ours. Judging is a kind of endorsement. It's an exercise of the subject's authority. Responsibility, commitment, endorsement, and authority are all normative notions. Kant understands concepts as functions of judgment in the sense that the concepts applied in a judgment determine what the subject has made himself responsible for, committed itself to, endorsed, or invested with its authority. In judging, subjects normatively bind themselves by rules, by concepts, that determine the nature and extent of their commitments. By pursuing an account with this shape, Kant makes urgent the question of how to understand the normative bindingness, his Verbindlichkeit, of the concepts applied in judging. Where the early modern tradition, beginning with Descartes, had worried about our immediate, non-representational grip on concepts, for Kant the problem becomes rather understanding the normative grip that concepts have on us. What is it to be committed to or responsible for the claim that things are thus and so? The second Kantian idea, on which Hegel's conceptualist approach to the representational dimension of intentionality is based, is that the responsibility in question should be understood as a kind of task responsibility. It's the responsibility to do something. What one's responsible for doing, in committing oneself to P, is integrating that new commitment into the constellation of prior commitments, so as to sustain its exhibition of the kind of unity distinctive of apperception. This integration is a species of the genus Kant calls synthesis, which is why the structural unity in question is called a synthetic unity of apperception. This integrative task responsibility has three dimensions: critical, ampliative, and justificatory. These are species of rational obligations, for they are articulated by which commitments serve as reasons for or against which others. One's critical integrative synthetic task responsibility is to reject commitments that are materially incompatible with other commitments one has acknowledged. One's ampliative integrative synthetic task responsibility is to acknowledge commitments that are material consequences of other commitments one has acknowledged. And one's justificatory integrative synthetic task responsibility is to be able to provide reasons for the commitments one has acknowledged by citing other commitments one acknowledges of which they are material consequences. Those are the ought-to-dos that correspond to the ought-to-bes that one's cognitive commitments, judgments, or beliefs ought to be consistent, complete, and justified. They're norms of rationality. When explicitly acknowledged, they're norms of systematicity, Kant says. Since judging consists in implicitly committing oneself to fulfill the critical, ampliative, and justificatory integrative synthetic task responsibilities, in judging at all, one implicitly undertakes these rational, systematic commitments. Collectively, they define the rational, normative, synthetic unity of apperception. Hegel sees that this account of the activity of judging has immediate consequences for the understanding of the contents that are judged. For what one has taken responsibility for, committed oneself to in judging that things are thus and so. The rational articulation of the normative synthetic integrative task responsibility Kant identifies as the kind of endorsement distinctive of judging means that we can understand judgeable contents in terms of what we're doing in judging. For those contents must determine the rational relations such judgeable contents stand into one another. What's a reason for and against what? The critical integrative synthetic task responsibility requires that judgeable contents stand to one another in relations of material incompatibility. The ampliative and justificatory integrative synthetic task responsibilities require that judgeable contents stand to one another in relations of material consequence. And that's to say that judgeable contents must have conceptual content in just the sense that Hegel himself endorses. That concept of the conceptual, he thinks, is already implicit in Kant's account of judging. Hegel extracts his conception of conceptual contentfulness from what's required to synthesize a constellation of commitments exhibiting that rational normative unity distinctive of apperception. This is a broadly functionalist idea, for it's the idea of understanding judgeable contents in terms of the role judgings play in the integrative process that is Kantian apperceiving. This functionalist explanatory strategy is of the first importance in understanding not only Hegel's conception of the expressive dimension of intentionality, conceptual that intentionality, but also the way he builds on that to offer an account of the representational dimension of intentionality. What's functionally reconstructed in terms of role in the synthesis of apperception is, of course, at most a part of Kant's understanding of the conceptual. For this abstract top-down approach to concepts does not essentially depend on their contrast and collaboration with intuitions. Kant himself would insist that for this reason, understanding concepts solely in terms of relations of material incompatibility and consequence, apart from any relation to intuitions, must be a purely formal one. So conceived, concepts for him would be empty in the sense of being devoid of representational content. From the point of view of Hegel's conceptualist explanatory strategy, this conception of the expressive or conceptual dimension of intentionality provides the raw materials in terms of which the representational dimension has to be understood. Hegel sees that Kant envisages a normative approach not only to the expressive conceptual dimension of intentionality, de dicto that intentionality, but also to the representational dimension, de re of intentionality. The conceptual content of a judgment is what one makes oneself responsible for in judging, and its representational content, what's represented by it, is what one makes oneself responsible to. For Hegel's Kant, we've seen, being responsible for a judgment to the effect that P consists in being responsible for integrating it into a constellation of one's prior commitments so as to sustain the rational normative unity characteristic of apperception. What the judgment is about, what's represented by it, is what exercises a distinctive kind of authority over assessments of its correctness, as, we might want to say, a representing of that represented. Something, paradigmatically a judging, is intelligible as being a representing just insofar as it's responsible for its correctness to something that thereby counts as represented by it. In Kant's terms, the objective form of judgment is the object equals X, which every judgment as such is responsible to for its correctness. The subjective form of judgment, the I think which can accompany every judging, marks the knower who is responsible for the judgment, that is, responsible for integrating it with the others for which that knower takes the same kind of responsibility. In the form in which this thought appears in Hegel's introduction, represented objects are what serve as a normative standard, a Maßstab, for assessments of commitments that count as representing those objects just in virtue of that constellation of authority and responsibility. Hegel's idea is to apply the functionalist explanatory strategy, which looked to normative role in the synthetic integrative activity of judging for its understanding of the conceptual dimension of judgeable contents, also for the understanding of the representational dimension of content. That is, he looks to what knowing subjects need to do in order thereby to count as acknowledging the authority of something to serve as a standard for assessing the correctness of a judgment in order to understand representational relations. If he can exhibit that kind of doing as an aspect of the synthetic integrative activity in terms of which the conceptual dimension of content is explained, he will have carried out the conceptualist explanatory strategy of understanding the representational dimension of intentionality in terms of the expressive conceptual dimension, explaining of intentionality in terms of that intentionality. I take it that the main task of the last two-thirds of the introduction to the phenomenology is to sketch this way of working out the conceptualist explanatory strategy for understanding the relations between the two dimensions of intentionality. The underlying logical flow below the surface, as I understand it, is first, the starting point is Kant's normative conception of judgment, which sees judging as endorsing, committing oneself to, or taking responsibility for some judgeable content. That idea is made more definite by the Kantian account of judging as integrating a new commitment into a constellation of prior commitments. That idea is in turn filled in by understanding the synthetic integrative activity as having the tripartite structure of satisfying critical, ampliative, and justificatory task responsibilities. Fourth, to this idea is conjoined the functionalist strategy of understanding judgeable contents as articulated by the relations they must stand in order to play their role in that activity, as what one is endorsing, committing oneself to, or taking responsibility for. Fifth, in light of the tripartite structure of synthesizing a constellation of commitments exhibiting the rational unity distinctive of apperception, this thought yields a conception of judgeable contents as articulated by rational relations of material incompatibility and material consequence. The result is Hegel's conception of conceptual contentfulness. The strategy for implementing the conceptualist order of explanation is to treat this account of the expressive conceptual dimension of intentionality as providing the raw materials and also the model for an account of the representational dimension of intentionality and conceptual content. Sixth, alongside Kant's normative conception of judgment, a normative conception of representation is discerned. A judgment counts as representing some represented object insofar as it's responsible to that object for its correctness, insofar as the object exercises authority over or serves as a standard for assessments of its correctness. And seventh, the strategy is then to apply the functionalist idea again to understand representational content in terms of what's required to serve as a normative standard for assessments of the correctness of judgments as an aspect of the synthetic process of integrating those commitments into constellations of antecedent commitments exhibiting the rational unity distinctive of apperception. So that's what I want to explain now, is how that works. The task of making sense of the representational dimension of intentionality, according to the conceptualist strategy, is explaining what it is for some judgeable content articulated by its relations of material incompatibility and consequence to other such contents to function as representing some worldly state of affairs. Saying what role in the synthetic integrative process of judging a judgeable content must play in order to count as purporting to represent something is then satisfying what in the first lecture I called the mode of presentation condition. For it's saying what it is to be or to purport to be a mode of presentation of something else, a representing of some represented. Hegel's preferred way of talking about what I've been calling representings is what things are for consciousness. What things are for consciousness purports to be the appearance of a reality, of what things are in themselves. Satisfying the mode of presentation condition is saying what it is for something to show up as an appearance of something. The representing represented, appearance reality distinction, the distinction between what things are for consciousness and what they are in themselves, also Hegel's certainty-truth distinctions, line up for Hegel with the Kantian phenomena-noumena distinction. The question Hegel is asking is, what is it for something to be something for consciousness? This is asking the deepest and most important question about the representational dimension of intentionality. Hegel is not at all presupposing the notions of things being something for consciousness. It's not one of his primitives. Rather, he offers a functionalist account of representational purport and representational content that's modeled on, embedded in, and a development of the functionalist account of propositional content in terms of the activity of judging that he sees as implicit in Kant's way of proceeding. There, Hegel answers the question that would later be put as that of specifying the distinctive unity of the proposition, holistically, in terms of standing to other such judgeable contents in relations of material incompatibility and material consequence. We've seen that the first piece of the puzzle is the idea that for something to be something for consciousness is to be understood in normative terms of the distinctive kind of authority it exercises over assessments of the correctness of the judgments consciousness consists in. Judgments must be responsible to what's represented for their correctness, for them to be intelligible as representing it being about it, or being an appearance of it. As Hegel puts the point, what's represented must serve as a normative standard for judgings. The next question is how that thought can be operationalized in a functionalist spirit. That is, understood in terms of what one must do to count as acknowledging that authority, the responsibility of what things are for consciousness, which is to say judgments, to what things are in themselves. Consciousness itself must take its judgments to be representations of some reality. That is, to point beyond themselves to something that they answer to for their correctness. Otherwise, it would not be taking it that in judging, a consciousness is taking a stand on how things are in themselves. Its judgments would not be how things really are for consciousness. What we must understand then is the sense in which, as Hegel says, quote, consciousness provides itself with its own standard, end of the quote. Or again, how, quote, in what consciousness within its own self designates as the in itself or the true, we have the standard by which consciousness itself proposes to measure its knowledge, end of that quote. How is it, we can ask, that as he says, quote, the difference between the in itself and the for itself is already present in the very fact that consciousness knows an object at all. Something is to it, the in itself, but the knowledge or the being of the object for consciousness is to it still another moment, end of the quote. The distinction between what things are in themselves and what they are for consciousness must itself, he's saying, be something to consciousness. This passage marks an absolutely crucial, if seldom acknowledged, distinction. The distinction between things being something for consciousness and things being something to consciousness. It's easy to miss this distinction in Hegel's texts, because unlike the phrases for consciousness, for Bewusstsein, in themselves, an sich, to consciousness, Hegel expresses without an explicit preposition. He puts it in the dative, an anaphoric expression, ihm, referring to consciousness, what it is to consciousness, to it, ihm. What Hegel tells us is something to consciousness is just the distinction between what things are for consciousness and what they are in themselves. I take it that what something is for consciousness is in the first instance the content of a judgment, something that's explicit. Judgeable contents are explicit in the sense of being thinkable and stateable in declarative sentences or that clauses. They're propositional contents. And we've seen Hegel understand such contents in terms of the relations of material incompatibility and hence material consequence they stand into one another. And he understands those relations in terms of the role judgeable contents play in the rational synthetic process of integration and rectification of commitments so as to maintain the unity characteristic of apperception. By contrast, what things are to consciousness is a functional matter of how they're implicitly taken or practically treated by consciousness. In what it does, he's saying, consciousness practically distinguishes between what things are for it and what they are in themselves. It functionally distinguishes between appearance and reality. Consciousness, he says, is their comparison. So we must understand how what consciousness does, that is essential to its being intelligible as consciousness, can be understood as practically acknowledging this distinction between appearance and reality. That'll be understanding how, quote, consciousness is, on the one hand, consciousness of the object, and on the other, consciousness of itself, consciousness of what to it is the true, and consciousness of its knowledge of the truth, close quote. Well, what consciousness as such does is judge, engage in the synthetic integrative activity that creates and maintains the synthetic unity of apperception. So the distinction between appearance and reality, what things are for consciousness and what they are in themselves, representings and representeds, must be intelligible in terms of functional roles with respect to that activity. What Hegel calls natural consciousness itself does not need to have these metaconceptual concepts. It does not need to be able to apply them explicitly in judgments. But we, the phenomenological consciousness, who are thinking about the activity of natural consciousness, must be able to attribute to it a grasp, implicit and practical though it is, of what these concepts make explicit, a grasp that's somehow implicit in what consciousness does. The normative construal of representation teaches us that the role something must play in practice in order to be functioning as a reality that's represented by or appearing in a judgment is that of a normative standard for the assessment of its correctness. What in the first lecture I called the rational constraint condition tells us that what serves as a standard of assessment of judgeable contents must be able to serve as a reason for that assessment. It must, at least in principle, be available to consciousness as a reason. To be serviceable as a reason, what plays the role of a standard of assessment must be in conceptual shape. It must stand to representings and representables in relations of material incompatibility and consequence. That's what's required for it to be able to serve as a reason for or against judgments, a standard with respect to which they can be assessed as correct or incorrect. And with that thought, we arrive at the crux of Hegel's functionalist account of representational purport. Hegel's term for the process by which new commitments are integrated into a constellation of old ones is experience, Erfahrung. The aspect of that process on which his account of the representational purport of judgeable contents turns is the critical one, in which incompatibilities that result from adding a new judgment are acknowledged and resolved. The systematic normative obligation along this dimension is a task responsibility. It's the responsibility to do something. What one is obliged to do is to restore the synthetic unity characteristic of apperception by repairing the incoherence that results when a subject finds itself with incompatible commitments. This process, Hegel says, is the experience of error. Consider an example. A naive subject looks at a stick half submerged in the water of a pond and perceptually acquires a belief that the stick is bent. Upon pulling it out, she acquires the belief that it's straight. Throughout, she has believed that it's rigid and that removing it from water won't change its shape. These judgments are jointly incompatible. Can't be both bent and straight under those circumstances. Acknowledging that is acknowledging that a mistake has been made. Those acknowledgments are acknowledgments of the practical responsibility to restore compatibility to one's commitments, the critical task responsibility. What one must do is reject or modify at least one of the commitments in the offending constellation. Suppose our subject gives up the belief that the stick is bent, keeping the belief that it's straight, as well as the other collateral commitments. Our subject might have made the choice she did concerning what to retain and what to reject in the light of her belief that she's much more experienced and reliable at visually judging shapes looked at through air or water than through both. Notice first that in treating the two shape commitments as materially incompatible in the context of collateral commitments to rigidity and shape constancy, the subject is implicitly treating them as having a common subject, as being about one and the same object. For commitments to stick A being bent and to stick B being straight are not incompatible. It's only if it's the same stick to which one is attributing those incompatible properties that the resulting judgeable contents are incompatible with one another. Hegel discusses this issue at some length in the perception chapter. Taking two commitments to be incompatible by acknowledging in practice the obligation to revise at least one of them is treating them as being about one object and to be attributing incompatible properties to it. In other words, it's treating them as representings of a common represented. Practically acknowledging the incompatibility of two judgeable commitments involves a kind of representational triangulation. It's implicitly treating them as sharing a topic, as being about the same thing. To say that this acknowledgement of common representational purport is implicit is to say that the representational purport is acknowledged in what the subject does, rather than explicitly as the propositional content of a judgment to the effect that these different senses, conceptual contents, pick out the same referent. That is, it's a matter of what those commitments are to consciousness, not what they are for consciousness. The stick is both bent and straight for consciousness, but the incompatibility of those commitments is, in this simplest case, only something to consciousness. This is a point about the first stage of the process that is the experience of error. Acknowledgement of the material incompatibility of some commitments the subject has made. At this stage, the incompatible commitments are all on a level. No invidious assessments of their relative authority or credibility have yet been made. What I've said so far is that even at this stage, we can understand an acknowledgement of the joint representational purport of two commitments as being implicit in the practical acknowledgement of their material incompatibility. Again, to judge that the bent judgment and the straight judgment are incompatible is to treat them as attributing those incompatible properties to the same object. This purely formal dimension of practical representational purport is complemented by another richer dimension that emerges only at the next stage in the experience of error. For acknowledgement of incompatibility, that is, of the presence of some error or other among the commitments that are being taken to be mutually incompatible, is to be followed by revision of at least some of those commitments. The second, rectification stage of the experience of error consists in doing what at the first stage one acknowledged one's practical obligation to do: repair the acknowledged incompatibility by revising or rejecting some of the offending commitments. In our example, in relinquishing the bent stick belief and retaining the straight stick belief, the subject is treating the first as presenting a mere appearance, and the second as presenting the corresponding reality. For at this stage in the experience of error, the mistake has been localized and identified. The problem, the subject practically takes it, is the bent stick commitment. It's an error. Rejecting it is practically taking it not to express how things really are. For endorsing a judgeable content is what one must do in order thereby to be taking or treating it in practice as expressing how things really are. The subject had previously practically accorded that status to the bent stick judgment. Repudiating that prior commitment is taking it no longer to deserve that status. The subject takes it to have been revealed, by its collision with other commitments, as merely purporting to express how things really are. That is, as being a mere appearance. Furthermore, the triangulation point ensures that the rejected bent stick judgment is practically construed not just as an appearance, but as an appearance of the reality presented by the retained commitment. What appeared as bent, the stick, has been revealed as really straight. In the experience of error, both the straight stick and bent stick commitments are practically taken or treated as modes of presentation of a reality, the stick, one veridically representing and one misrepresenting it. Both of these stages of the process that is the experience of error, the acknowledgement of the incompatibility and its rectification, contribute to the satisfaction of the mode of presentation condition on a construal of intentional content. For the way judgments function, the roles they play, in these phases of the experience of error, show what it is one must do in order thereby to count as acknowledging in practice the representational dimension of conceptual content, what it is to take or treat judgments as representings or appearances of how some represented thing really is. In the first phase of the experience of error, the authority of the straight stick belief collides with that of the bent stick belief. In the second phase, the authority of the straight stick belief is endorsed, while that of the bent stick belief is rejected. In the context of collateral beliefs concerning rigidity, what can change the shape of rigid objects, and the relative reliability of visual perception under various conditions, the straight stick belief is accepted as a standard for assessments of the correctness, the veridicality of the bent stick belief. Since they're incompatible, the latter is rejected as incorrect according to that standard. The bent stick belief is assessed as responsible to the constellation of commitments that includes the straight stick belief. All of that is to say that as presented in the straight stick judgment, the straight stick is performing the normative functional office characteristic of the reality represented by some representing. It's practically treated as being, it is to consciousness, an authoritative standard for assessments of the correctness of representings that count as about it, just in virtue of being responsible to it for such assessments. So when we look at the role played by various commitments in the experience of error, we see that the mode of presentation commitment condition is satisfied in the sense required by the normative construal of representing. Furthermore, the rational constraint condition is also satisfied by understanding representational purport functionally in terms of the role conceptually articulated judgeable contents play in processes that have the structure of the experience of error. For in the context of the constellation of collateral commitments in our example, the straight stick belief provides a reason for rejecting the bent stick belief. The collision between the two is rationally resolved. Belief in the differential reliability of visual perception under the conditions that led to the endorsement of the bent stick and straight stick perceptual judgments, conjoined with the straight stick belief, constitute an argument against the bent stick belief. In undergoing the experience of error, our subject in practice treats reality, the straight stick, as providing rational constraint on the assessment of various appearances as veridical. In proceeding this way, the subject in practice takes or treats the bent stick belief as expressing just what things are for consciousness, and treats the straight stick belief as expressing what things are in themselves. Those statuses, in turn, are what the beliefs are to consciousness, or implicitly. For the subject of the experience of error, Hegel's natural consciousness, need not explicitly deploy concepts of reality and appearance, represented and representing, what things are in themselves, what things are for consciousness, of noumena and phenomena, in order for what it does in retaining one of the contextually materially incompatible dyad of commitments and rejecting the other, to be intelligible as practically taking or treating one as presenting how things really are, and the other as presenting a mere appearance. One is to consciousness what the stick is in itself, namely straight, and the other is to consciousness what the stick is, or was, merely for consciousness. This, I think, is what Hegel means when he says, quote, consciousness provides itself with its own standard. It's how, quote, in what consciousness within its own self designates as the in itself or the true, we have the standard by which consciousness itself proposes to measure its knowledge. End of the quote. This account of consciousness's practical implicit grasp of the distinction and the relation between what things are for it and what those things are in themselves, how that distinction is something to consciousness, but not yet necessarily for consciousness, is the solution to the challenge of the Bradleyan regress, which in the previous lecture I pointed out as a successor to the Cartesian regress of representation. This is the regress that threatens not when one worries that representings must themselves be known representationally, but rather the one that threatens when one worries that the representational relation between representings and representeds must be known representationally. The regress is avoided in Hegel's account because the representational relation is not required to be something explicitly for consciousness, but only something to consciousness, a matter of how it's implicitly treated in what consciousness does as part of the experience of error. On Hegel's model, the conceptual content shared by representing and represented, appearance and reality, phenomenon and noumenon, commitment and fact, is abstracted from the two different forms that relations of material incompatibility and consequence can take. The subjective form, made explicit by deontic normative vocabulary, and the objective form, made explicit by alethic modal vocabulary. Conceptual content is essentially, and not just accidentally, what can take these two forms. The central metaphysical concept that incorporates and expresses this point is determinate negation. It articulates the sense in which anything, thoughts, facts, properties, conceptual contents, can be determinate by strongly contrasting with, precluding, excluding other determinants, Spinoza's omnis determinatio est negatio. On the objective side, this means that how things are is essentially also a matter of the structure of its alethic modal relations to what it makes impossible and what it makes necessary. On the subjective side, it means that commitments can be understood as determinate only in the context of the functional role they play in the process of acquiring and, crucially, revising commitments. For it's that process that's governed by the deontic normative relations of incompatibility and consequence that articulate the conceptual contents of those commitments. One of the things that's always been hard to understand about Hegel's conception of determinate negation, and so his conception of concepts and their contents, is his connection of those traditional logical notions with dynamic categories of movement, process, of restlessness. What lies behind it is this connection between incompatibility in the normative sense and the process of commitment acquisition and revision that is the experience of error. Hegel regards the subjective articulation of the conceptual contents of commitments by deontic normative relations of material incompatibility and consequence, and the objective articulation of the conceptual contents of facts and properties by alethic modal relations of material incompatibility and consequence, as two sides of one coin, two aspects of one conception. His substantive claim is that his concepts of determinate negation, and so conceptual content, do not equivocate. Rather, they have a fine structure that's articulated by the relations between the two intimately related forms, subjective and objective, that conceptual contents defined by determinate negation and mediation can take. This claim plays a central role in his strategy of understanding the subjective and objective sides of the intentional nexus of knowledge, and later on in the book, agency, by abstracting them as complementary aspects of conceptual content. A strategy he contrasts already in the introduction with traditional approaches that seek to take antecedently and independently specified conceptions of subject and object and somehow bolt them together to get an intelligible picture of their intentional relations. That approach, he claims, is doomed so long as the psychological conception of the conceptual, and hence of the intelligible, restricts conceptual content to the subjective side of what then inevitably appears as a gulf of intelligibility, separating knowing and acting subjects from the objective world they know about and act on and in. But how are we to understand the conception of conceptual content, articulated by relations of determinate negation and mediation, as somehow amphibious between its two forms, subjective normative and objective modal? This question obviously goes to the heart of our understanding of Hegel's idealism. I think it should be understood in terms of two claims. First, deontic normative vocabulary is a pragmatic meta-vocabulary for alethic modal vocabulary. Second, as a consequence, there's a kind of sense-dependence relation between these vocabularies. On the first point, deontic normative vocabulary lets one say what it is one must do in order thereby to be saying what alethic modal vocabulary lets one say. For what one must do in order to count as grasping the contents expressed by alethic modal vocabulary, by the claim that it's impossible at both P and Q, or that if P then necessarily R, is in practice to take or treat commitments to P and Q as normatively incompatible, so that one cannot be entitled to both. And commitment to P is normatively entailing commitment to R, so that if one is committed to the first, one counts as thereby committed to the second. It's only by knowing how to accord with the norms expressed in the deontic vocabulary that one can count as able to understand and apply modal vocabulary. Practically treating one's commitments as standing in these normative relations to one another is implicitly understanding them as commitments concerning what's objectively impossible and necessary. That is, as appearances of a reality articulated by such alethic modal relations. As we've seen, engaging in the experience of error, governed by practical norms that respect deontic relations of incompatibility is what taking or treating one's commitments as appearances, representings of some represented reality consists in. That deontic normative vocabulary in this way plays the expressive role of being a pragmatic metavocabulary for alethic modal vocabulary means that one cannot understand alethic modal vocabulary, cannot deploy it with understanding, unless one has mastered the normatively governed practices made explicit by deontic vocabulary. That's a claim about practically grasping what's expressed by alethic modal vocabulary, about what one must be able to do in order to say what it says. It's not a claim about what one must be true for what one says using the modal vocabulary to be true. That is, the claim is not that unless some claims formulable in deontic normative vocabulary were true, no claims formulable in alethic modal vocabulary could be true. It is not and does not entail the claim that unless some concept users could apply normative vocabulary, no modal claims would be true. The claim is rather that unless one practically understands what's said by normative vocabulary, unless one can do the things, engage in the practices that are specifiable in normative vocabulary, one cannot understand what's said by modal vocabulary. That is, the claim is that there's a kind of sense dependence of modal vocabulary on what's expressed by normative vocabulary, not a kind of reference dependence. The distinction between sense dependence and reference dependence can be made clear by an example that has nothing to do with normativity or modality. Regardless of whether or not this would be a good way to think about the concept of beauty, we can define a response-dependent concept, I'll call it beauty star, by stipulating that some object or situation counts as beautiful star just in case it would, under suitable circumstances, produce a response of pleasure in a suitable subject suitably exposed to it. Then the property of being beautiful star is sense-dependent on that of pleasure. One could not understand the amphibiously corresponding concept beautiful star unless one understood the concept of pleasure, for the one is defined in terms of the other. But it does not at all follow that something could not be beautiful star unless something could respond with pleasure. On this definition, there were sunsets that were beautiful star before there were any suitable, pleasure-capable responders, and they would still have been beautiful star even if there never had been such responders. For it still could be the case that if there were such responders present, they would respond or would have responded with pleasure. In just the same way, if we define a planet or a star as supraterran, just in case it has a mass more than twice that of the Earth, we're not thereby committing ourselves to denying that a planet could have that property in a possible world in which the Earth did not exist. Depending on how they're specified, properties can be sense-dependent on other properties, as beautiful star is on pleasure and supraterran is on the mass of the Earth, without being reference-dependent on them. That is, something can exhibit a property P that's sense-dependent, but not reference-dependent, on a property P prime in a world in which nothing exhibits the property P prime. The claimed dependence of modal properties on norm-governed activities of accepting and rejecting commitments is of the sense dependence rather than the reference dependence kind. The objective world would still be conceptually structured in the sense of consisting of facts about objects and their properties and relations, articulated by alethic modal relations of relative compossibility and necessitation, even in worlds that never included knowing and acting subjects who applied normatively articulated concepts in undertaking and rejecting commitments. The mind dependence of the objective world asserted by this dimension of Hegel's idealism, we might call it objective idealism, is not the objectionable Berkeleyan reference dependence kind, what Kant calls subjective idealism, but of the much more plausible, or at least colorable, sense dependence kind. We can understand and describe possible worlds without subjects to whom deontic normative vocabulary applies, as nonetheless making applicable alethic modal vocabulary. But our capacity to make sense of such possibilities depends on our being able to engage in practices made explicit by the application of deontic normative vocabulary. The sort of model that Hegel constructs to contrast with two-stage representational models committed to a strong difference of intelligibility between representings and represented, depends on an account of conceptual contentfulness committed to the amphibiousness of conceptual contents between a subjective form articulated by deontic normative relations of incompatibility and consequence, and an objective form articulated by alethic modal relations of incompatibility and consequence. The relation of correspondence between them is that of a pragmatic metavocabulary that induces a kind of practical sense dependence. According to this approach, modal realism entails conceptual realism, which entails objective idealism. In his introduction, Hegel is introducing us not just to his book, but also to the metaconceptual categorical framework that he elsewhere calls Vernunft, by contrast to the traditional modern metaconceptual categorical framework that reached its most explicit and revealing form in Kant, which he calls Verstand. Thinking in the Vernunft way involves saying things that are strange indeed from the standpoint of the traditional framework of Verstand. These are such claims as that since there is some determinate way the world objectively is, it, no less than thought about it, comes in conceptual, hence intelligible form, and would do even if there had never been concept-applying subjects. Accordingly, thought and being, represented and representing, subject and substance, in the idiom of the preface, are essentially paired forms that conceptual content can take. The concept of negation, incompatibility, in terms of which we should understand determinateness, whether of subjective thought or objective fact, essentially involves a principle of motion, of change, of active practical doing, as odd as this seems from the point of view of the logical tradition indigenous to Verstand. Subjective practices and processes specifiable in deontic normative vocabulary, and objective relations and facts specifiable in alethic modal vocabulary, are two complementary aspects or dimensions of whatever is determinate and hence intelligible. We're now in a position to see these as claims about practical sense dependence relations, consequent upon the pragmatic metavocabulary relation between normative and modal vocabularies. Hegel's aim in the opening paragraphs of the introduction to the Phenomenology is to convince us that if the epistemological possibility of genuine knowledge and so much as the intelligibility of error are not to be semantically ruled out of court at the outset, we must broaden the range of models of the possible relations between appearance and reality, so as to encompass not only the familiar Verstand semantic paradigm, but also the new unfamiliar Vernunft one, in spite of the initially strange and unpalatable consequences it embraces. Well, I ended my first lecture with a discussion of the two forms conceptual content can be seen to take once we adopt Hegel's non-psychological conception of it, as articulated by relations of material incompatibility and consequence, namely subjective and objective forms. It's this conception that makes it possible for us to avoid excavating a gulf of intelligibility between knower and known, appearance and reality, representings and representeds in our semantics, which must then lead, he thinks, to skepticism in our epistemology. We're now in a position to understand the relation between propositional commitments, judgments or beliefs, articulated by normative deontic relations of incompatibility on the subjective side of certainty, of what things are for consciousness, and facts or possible states of affairs articulated by alethic modal relations of incompatibility on the objective side of truth, what things are in themselves, as itself a representational relation, a matter of the relation between representings and representeds. We can see how our commitments are intelligible as appearances of an objective reality. That intelligibility is functionalist and pragmatist. Now we know what we must do in order thereby, implicitly, to be practically taking or treating our commitments as appearances of a reality. So the distinction between what things are for consciousness and what they are in themselves is itself something to consciousness. The account rehearsed here of representational purport in terms of the experience of error operationalizes what in my first lecture I called the intelligibility of error and genuine knowledge criteria of epistemological adequacy on semantic accounts of intentional contentfulness and aboutness. This whole lecture has been an extended discussion of how in the same terms the mode of presentation condition can be satisfied, how to understand the representational dimension of intentionality in terms of the expressive conceptual dimension. And I've concluded this lecture by talking about how that first dimension, and so the second, can be understood in terms of what one is doing in undergoing the experience of error. That is, I've been talking about how the knowing subject's activity, which is discussed in deontic normative terms of commitment and entitlement, can be understood as involving a representational purport, as an appearance, what things are for consciousness, of the reality, what things are in themselves, constituted by objective states of affairs discussed in alethic modal terms of necessity and possibility. What in the first lecture I called the rational constraint condition is the requirement that what's represented be intelligible as providing reasons for assessments of the correctness of representings. And it's shown up here as a consequence of the normative construal of representation that Hegel sees as already introduced by Kant. In the context of the account offered here of representational purport, in terms of functional role in cognitive processes characterized by the experience of error, we can see how the reciprocal sense dependence of the subjective and objective dimensions of the meta-concept of material incompatibility, or determinate negation, consequent upon deontic normative vocabulary, serving as a pragmatic meta-vocabulary for alethic modal vocabulary, articulates a deep connection between satisfaction of the mode of presentation condition and the rational constraint condition. In the next lecture, I pursue further Hegel's conception of how our grasp of the concept of truth depends on the practical experience of error, and offer detailed readings of some of the most puzzling passages at the very end of the introduction.